So Phillipa is an architectural paint researcher and conservator with a background in art history and is currently undertaking a part-time PhD in 19th century paint. As well as being our new chair, she is also a member of the committee currently writing the EU standard for decorative finishes investigation. If you want to ask questions during the talk, please do type them into the chat and I can read them out at the end. We'll have about 10 or 15 minutes. So I will pass you over to Pip. Oh, you're on mute, Pip.
That's always useful. That's better. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone see the screen? Okay, so I'll just make a start. So this is going to be a very, very brief history of wallpaper and a little bit on the conservation of them. I'm aware that we've got some conservators from various different backgrounds or disciplines, and we've also got some non-conservators and people who just sort of work sort of more in the heritage area. So again, I'll keep it very brief and hopefully not too complicated or technical. So the origins of wallpaper, this is mainly going to look at wallpaper in the UK and in the West. So obviously wallpaper has been used in China and Japan for centuries, but really it's only been used in the UK, Europe and the West since about the 16th century. So prior to this, we tended to have tapestries or wall paintings. Tapestries were decorative and functional. They kept warmth in the building and also helped isolate the sound as well. And you can see some examples here of Donington Hall and some tapestries in paintings as well by Hans Holbein, and some wallpapers as well some wall paintings as well in Haddon Hall. So early wallpapers tended to try to replicate these finishes. Obviously, tapestries were incredibly expensive to make. You had to weave them and in some cases dye every single fibre. So they were really only available to the upper class and the rich. So as a sort of cheaper option, wallpaper was invented. So again, some of this comes around sort of the 16th century, but here's some examples of wallpaper that very obviously copy tapestries and other finishes that are on walls at the moment. And you can see a sort of a card saying that paper imitating Irish stitch, so tapestries, in the newish fashion, flockwork, wainscoting, so wood panelling, marbling, damask, and turkey work. So again, the whole point of wallpaper really was to replicate these sort of more expensive finishes. Early wallpaper production was made from plant fibers. So we've got these are kozo fibers up here. So that's actually one of the most common and strongest fibers used in Japanese paper rather than European paper. In European paper, it tended to be hemp, cotton or linen. So this is kind of tended to be referred to as rag paper. And it was generally made using a decal and a frame. So a decal is this wired section here. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving, but on the left-hand side, there's an image of a person who would dip this decal and frame into a vat of these fibers that are suspended in water. And as they lift out, these fibers settle on the surface of the paper at random intervals and create a sort of a mesh. And then they're flipped out and dried and turned into paper. So normally a size would be applied, so just an animal glue, normally an animal glue, and this would stop the ink leaching into the entire paper. Again, this decal, so this sort of like wire mesh area is normally sort of parallel lines of wire mesh, but from around the 1750s, this turned into more of a sort of a woven mesh rather than these lines. So this is why you get this what's called laid paper. In the bottom right hand corner, you can see you get these distinctive lines across. And with wove paper in the 1750s, you don't tend to get these lines. This is also how you get watermarks. So if you can see in the bottom central photo, you can see that there's the lettering. And again, that's just where the paper is thinner there, so the light shines through. So that's one way to actually date wallpaper as well, by seeing whether the paper is laid or wove. So the earliest wallpaper that we found in the UK dates from about 1509, and it was found in Christ College Chapel in Cambridge. And it was actually found on some of the near the rafters. Another example is from the 1580s, and this was in a private home. So the Cambridge one is on the right-hand side and the private one is on the left-hand side. And you can see these still very much replicate a textile. You've got these kind of damask patterns, or you've got these kind of more tapestry feels. And again, I'm not sure if you can see very well on the image, but you can see on the left-hand side, you can almost see the joins of these small pieces of paper as well, as they've just been made in small pieces of paper and then printed. So yeah, wallpaper tended to be hand printed either by wood block or sometimes stencils as well, and this tended to be in distemper or oil. So by the 18th century, you're getting a few more colours in, and wallpaper is becoming more popular. And it's also starting to become a fashionable item in its own right, rather than something that just directly replicates or imitates a more expensive finish. But you can see that there is still this kind of idea of kind of the fabrics that are coming through. Again, you've got these florals, you've got these little scenes as if it was a tapestry. And even though these here look like quite dull colours, they actually used incredibly bright colours as well. So you can see on the left-hand side, the top image, right at the bottom, you've got this really, really vivid pink. And that area was where this area had been protected from light with a border. And when that border was removed, you can see the original colour that would have been all within this sort of area flower. So you can see that it's a really, really vivid colour. Again, there's an example from the 18th century on the right-hand side as well that's got this really vivid blue and very sort of almost modern looking design. So when we think of 18th century wallpapers, it's not all this kind of like, there is this refined pattern, but there also are incredibly bright colours there as well. And again, wallpaper, you can tell that wallpaper started to be seen as a luxury because it started becoming taxed. This is also a really good way of dating wallpaper as well, if you're lucky enough to find what's called a tax stamp on the back of each individual piece of paper. Wallpaper tax was in existence from 1712 to 1836. So yes, a really good way of dating wallpaper. Wallpaper at this time, prior to this, it could be lined straight onto the walls. There wasn't really much sort of need to keep it completely flat or completely smooth. But around the 1810s, lining paper starts to come into fashion, and having a smoother, more refined surface starts to become slightly more fashionable as well. So lining paper by itself was produced, but it was much more common to use just newspaper or whatever paper you already had to hand. And then as well, you start getting canvas and batten lining as well. So you start seeing the walls are battened out and a canvas is stretched over the top, and then the wallpaper and or lining paper is applied over this. So you're starting by the early to mid 19th century, you're starting to get a much smoother, flatter, more sort of perfect finish for this wallpaper. So by the early, well, mid-18th, early 19th century, chinoiserie and scenic wallpaper comes into effect. So some of this is what you call sort of almost original Chinese wallpaper that was produced in China. But sometimes this was produced specifically for a Western market. So it was produced in China, made for the Western market, but you also got some produced in the West as well. And these can be the same designs, which were then coloured back in the UK, or various colours made. And you get these sort of, it tends to be hand painted as well. And you get these incredible really beautiful scenic designs with normally birds and floral and scenic views. And this idea of a scenic view was then mechanized. So instead of the hand painting Chinese wallpaper that we saw earlier, this was slightly more mechanized, although even though it was mechanized, this is still incredibly complex. So this wallpaper here was made by a famous scenic wallpaper company called Zuber, and they're actually still in use today and still use some of the original blocks that they used in the early 19th century. So the picture we're looking at the moment is views of America. And this used 1,690 blocks. It used 223 different colors, and it was on 32 sheets, sort of lengths of wallpaper. So even though it was quote unquote mechanized, it was still an incredibly complex piece of wallpaper. And again, this is where wallpaper does become slightly political as well. So this wallpaper, original version of this wallpaper was actually rehung in the White House by Jackie Kennedy when she was doing renovations in the 1960s in the diplomatic reception room. And so the views of North America obviously show a very idealized view. You've got sort of like equal opportunities for everyone, and settlers being peacefully welcomed, which, as we all know, isn't exactly how it went down. But this kind of escapism and kind of like idealistic views is what these kind of wallpapers presented. And these were, again, politicized. So Zuber was a French company, so they supported the American War of Independence. And when that happened, they recreated these wallpapers with some of the foreground figures changed to represent scenes from the Wars of Independence. Now we're moving on to the 19th century a bit proper, and we start to get the mechanization of wallpaper. So instead of having short sheets of paper, you have long sheets developed. A machine invented in 1806 and sort of became more popular and widely used in the 1820s, meant that you could actually have these really long rolls of wallpaper rather than just using individual sheets that would then be painted together. And with this as well, you can get the long printing. So the whole process was much quicker and much less labor intensive as well. During the 1840s, wood pulp tended to be added to the paper, which made it much cheaper than just the rag paper that was used before. But this also has conservation issues later. Because of the wood fibers, the papers are inherently more acidic and they tend to become more brittle and yellow over time as well. New pigments developed during this century as well, meant that we could have really vivid patterns, as well as engraved rollers meant that we could get really, really complex patterns much cheaper and much quicker. Also by this period, so by 1836, the wallpaper tax had stopped, so wallpaper was much cheaper and readily available. So this meant that it was became much more popular, and you get these incredible designs and these incredible colors and really complex patterns available to sort of middle upper class, as well as just, you know, the highest in society as well. Even though these were incredibly commercially popular, they weren't exactly very well received always sort of in terms of design. There are several books written that specifically talk about the gaudiness of wallpaper. So for instance, you have the Yellow Wallpaper that was written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman in 1892, which basically has a woman having a mental breakdown that is facilitated by this really gaudy yellow wallpaper in the room she's isolated in. You've got False Principles of Design that was written by Henry Cole, that was an exhibition by Henry Cole in 1852 showing the terrible new designs that are coming through. And again, Henry Morley wrote a book, The House Full of Horrors, in the same year, 1852 as well, that just describes this sort of terrible new design in wallpaper. And one of the things that they really didn't like was the fact that it creates depth when wallpaper is a flat surface. So you've got these pillar and arch architecture, which kind of creates a false sense of depth. This kind of scenic view of the Crystal Palace was actually used in the House Full of Horrors book as an example of absolutely terrible design. In Hard Times by Charles Dickens, there's a quote that said, "You're not to have in any object of use or ornament what would be contradictory to fact." So the idea that walls are a flat surface, you shouldn't be having these depths and these scenes and these things that look three-dimensional. So this led to a design reform mostly led by William Morris. And again, William Morris wallpaper is what we tend to think of when we think of 19th century wallpaper, particularly in the latter period as well. So what you get here is you get this, you still get these naturalistic forms, but it's very clear that this is a flat surface. So again, even though there is sort of shading, it's all very flat. You've got these kind of almost return to these damask patterns that you saw in the tapestries. And again, the whole idea is this very flat pattern that doesn't hide the fact that it's a wall, essentially. And you've also got a bit of a return to the woodcut design and the feel of a woodcut design rather than these complex engraved patterns. Around the late 19th century as well, wallpaper and health become very highly linked. For one reason is the amount of arsenic that was in a lot of wallpapers, specifically this really, really vivid green. Again, copper arsenic pigments in a lot of pigments of different names, so emerald green, shield green. It's an incredible popular color, and it wasn't just in wallpaper. It was in paints, dresses, socks, fake fruit, and this abundance of arsenic became a sort of a really hot topic in the late 19th century. So wallpapers were advertised that were then free from arsenic as well. So you almost get sort of an advertising trend of having healthy wallpapers. The also benefit of wallpapers as well is that they start to develop washable wallpapers, or what's called sanitary papers. So these are wallpapers that tended to have a varnish over them. And one of the a common sort of pattern is this kind of this more sort of brown one. Obviously, again, you've got a varnish that's slightly discolored, but still this brownish sort of color is very common. And you've got the dado panel and dado rail in a paper, and then the sort of the main wallpaper as well. And you also get these kind of fake tiled type look of sanitary paper. You also get lincrusta as well, which is a sort of a linseed oil and wood pulp embossed paper. And again, this could be washed down, it could be cleaned, it was very durable, and it was very quote unquote hygienic. So wallpaper became, again, a very functional decorative finish. So whilst, yes, you could wash down paint, wallpaper is much more easy to put on, take off, and then with these new sanitary papers and lincrustas to wash down. You also get some embossed wallpapers called salamander, which were supposed to be more fireproof, mainly because they had asbestos in them. So sometimes be a bit careful if you're sampling certain embossed wallpapers. But again, it's this idea that the wallpaper is again a useful and functional decorative surface rather than just being something pretty to line your walls with. So in the interwar period, we see a little bit of a lull in wallpaper production here, again, mainly because of the wars and the lack of materials and people to make them. And you also see a sort of a more sort of modern refined colors. So you get sort of slightly more dull colored. You get these geometric shapes and large florals as well. However, by the mid-century, wallpaper is again seen as a cheap and easy way to redecorate your home. So you start to get these more bold print, you get these sort of very homely settings. You can see they become very fashionable. You've got almost this atomized futuristic pattern going on. So it's seen again as more of a modern finishing. But saying that, you do still get these florals and these kind of trellisy sort of patterns that we've seen right from the beginning in the 16th century all the way up till now. These sort of designs tend to sort of still continue despite having modern patterns come in as well. And then in the 60s, you kind of get this new generation of wallpaper that's, again, is supposed to be aimed towards sort of like pop culture and the youth. So you get these really bright pop colors. Again, you get kind of like those avocados that were popular in the 70s. You get vinyl papers that can be self-applied and removed very easily. You get these more sort of like metallic finishes as well. And again, you still do get these florals. So and again, even in the sort of more poppy areas, you still got florals running through as a design feature. And then in the 1980s and 1990s, you get a complete return back to tradition. So again, you've got very calm pastel colors. You've got these damask patterns. You've got these sort of almost 18th century sort of like lined papers with florals running up, and you've got this sort of like toile de jour features as well. And then now in the 21st century, there's been a wallpaper revival as well. So back to these very sort of bold colors. Again, a lot of them drawing on history. So you've got these florals here. You've got this chinoiserie style here. You've almost got the leaves that you could almost say were William Morris, but probably a little bit too realistic. Again, you've got imitations of another material, so imitations of marble here, and then you've got just totally wild, massive designs. But because we see these designs fluctuate and come back and forth throughout dates, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to date wallpaper simply from its aesthetics alone. So we're going to do a little test. So this is where you guys need to jump on the chat. So where do you think, what sort of date do you think this beautiful glittery wallpaper is from? From the 1890s, 1920s, or 1990s? Oops. Just gave you the answer there. So yeah, this is actually from the 1880s. It's from the Oberon, I think that's how you say it, Oberon design in the Westminster Wallpaper Collection by Essex & Co. So again, even though it looks like it should be, oh, I live getting drawn over, even though it should, you know, you'd think it's possibly 1920s because you've got these mica pigments, or, you know, realistically, probably a lot of you thought 1990s. It does actually date back all the way to the 1890s. Similarly, for this one, what are sort of people's idea here? 1620s, 1950s, or 2010s? Yeah. Getting a mix of, a lot of you are going 50s and 2010s. Yeah, so this one is actually from the 1950s. It's called Sicilian Lion, and it's from the Palladio collection by the Wallpaper Manufacturers Limited. And this was kind of a drive to get artists and designers behind wallpaper to create these really bold things, and just to rejuvenate the kind of the designs in wallpaper to make it fashionable and make it really attractive. Again, the scale of this is actually quite large, and part of the drive behind the collection was to make it attractive to architects to use in really big spaces. So again, it's this idea of just of rejuvenating wallpaper, but the kind of woodcut style and possibly the colors, you know, could make you think 1620s, but obviously the condition is much better, and a lot of you picked up on that. And the final one, this kind of delicate floral pastel. Do we think 1740s, 1860s, or 1990s? Yeah, we're getting a bit of a mix of these ones. Yeah, this is actually a Laura Ashley wallpaper. So, you know, it's specifically designed to recall the kind of like 18th century wallpapers. But yeah, it was made in 1993. And I don't know, I can definitely remember having some of this sort of type of wallpaper in my house. So but again, it's very similar. So you've got apart from just the aesthetics, you've got to use other things like the condition, like its context, and then maybe the material analysis as well, if you get to that level as well, when you're actually sort of looking to date wallpaper. Just looking at its pattern alone isn't always that useful. So now we're going to look a bit at the conservation issues. Again, this is going to be probably incredibly simplistic for a lot of the conservators, but hopefully it won't be too complex for all non-conservators out there. So some of the main issues that that wallpaper has to deal with, again, it's a very odd object in the fact that it sits between several different conservation specialisms. So again, obviously it's normally made of paper, so paper conservators, it's normally your remit, but again, it's normally in a building and applied directly to a wall as a decorative surface, so that when it falls into kind of decorative surfaces and historic interiors conservation. So it's in this weird in-between place where perhaps decorative surfaces and historic interiors don't feel 100% comfortable with it because we're not that used to paper always, and then paper conservators, obviously it's not in the context that you might normally work on either. So the main issues that arise with wallpaper, especially wallpaper in situ, are physical damage, theft and vandalism. Even though it's stuck to the wall, it can be taken off quite easily. Water, biological growth, pollutants and off-gassing, light, temperature and relative humidity, and also custodial neglect. So we'll just look at a couple of examples. So here we've got a couple of physical tears, and this is mainly where just the plaster has shifted, and obviously the plaster can't, the wallpaper can't, has broken where the plaster tear is because it can't move with the plaster. There's also been water ingress leak down, so we've got water staining down here, and we've also got biological growth coming through. Obviously, wallpaper paste tends to be a starch paste or starch-based paint, so perfect food for sort of bacteria and biological growth, and mold, and also the paper itself is food there. So so that's yes, physical tears, either due to the substrate it's on or just damage through it being near a wall and there being a chair rubbing up against it, or someone drilling a hole into the wall. And you can see as well, we've got a little paint splatter from when someone perhaps repainted the ceiling as well. So it is, because again, it's a surface, it's a decorative surface, it's a protective surface, it is going to get quite a lot of physical damage. And again, being in normally a room, there's a lot of potential for water ingress. Light as well is a really big one. Again, so if we look again at the wallpaper example where one area was covered, and so this pigment, which is probably a lake pigment potentially, has obviously been protected from light, and the area that hasn't been protected from light has almost completely faded. You can barely see that anything would be in these areas. So so light is a really big issue for wallpaper. But obviously, again, it's in a room that needs to be lit because people need to see what they're doing, and normally in rooms with windows. So again, that's something where historically it will have been exposed to light. So, and again, when we're looking at wallpaper, we've got to remember that we're probably looking at a faded colour as well. And then again, here's some more biological groups and pollutants for gassing. So this was found behind some wooden paneling. It's kind of a little window seat, and there was some paneling backboards. So again, you might get some off-gassing from the wood there, which is attacking the paper, and also humidity as well. It's falling off the walls because the adhesives no longer working, and the custodial neglect as well. So, but that's, when I say custodial neglect, it's not purposeful neglect, it's just the fact it was hidden behind paneling, so no one knew it was there, so no one could take care of it. And this happens a lot with wallpaper. You tend to find fragments in cupboards, in small spaces, maybe it's fallen underneath floorboards, and sometimes it just, well, sometimes it's protected because no one knows it's there, but sometimes it falls into disrepair again because no one understands it's there. Similarly, if it's been covered by more layers of wallpaper and something's been drilled through, no one's going to be able to see that this sort of fabulous patterned wallpaper is behind these layers, or potentially paint either. Theft, vandalism. Again, theft is a bit less of an issue, unless it's actually falling off the wall or sometimes just been put in a skip and then taken away. But vandalism is quite a big problem. So we've got some nice Sharpies and just felt tip pens probably here. And again, this probably comes down a bit to custodial neglect as well. But not all vandalism is bad. So again, this is on the same piece of wallpaper, but just further up. And this was from a 19th century room that was letted out. And this was letted out in the 1960s. So this guy, whoever D. Lawrence is, has written when he arrived and when he left. So, I mean, you know that this, you can visually tell from this wallpaper that it was in the 19th century, but you can see the history of this building because of the vandalism that's been left on the wallpaper. So even though we do think of vandalism as bad, sometimes graffiti can be really, really helpful as well. So it is a conservation issue, but not always one that you want to remove. So what do you do if you find historic wallpaper? Again, this is to non-conservators. The first thing's photograph and document. So photograph it in context, so a big picture of it in the room, so you get an idea of the scale and sort of where it is as well, and any overlying layers of either wallpaper or paint or sort of furniture as well. And then a good close-up one so that you can see the actual pattern design and get a little bit of an idea of the sort of the texture of it as well, which, you know, may help people to understand the materials a bit better. Be aware of hazardous pigments. Again, we've already talked about arsenic, but with all historic pigments, you have potential for hazardous materials, so mercury, lead, that sort of thing. And again, because of the way historic wallpaper is normally printed, these pigments are normally a little bit more fugitive, so they're probably more likely to just to brush off and get on your hands, and then you start eating arsenic and nobody's happy. If you find just loose fragments, try and store these away so that they don't get trampled on or damaged. And if you store them flat and away from damp areas or direct sunlight, if you have Melanex, it's best to store it in Melanex, but if not, just somewhere flat and safe where no one's going to put anything on top of it. And again, arrange for temporary or potentially more permanent cover as well. And then obviously contact a conservator. So some of the conservation options that we can look at. So there's two main options. There's conservation in situ and removal and conservation off-site. And both are appropriate. It just completely depends on the situation. So in situ conservation, this could be a very minimal intervention. So just as simply as consolidating back loose areas that might either collect dust and dirt when it forms an almost pocket, or has the risk of being caught and ripped. And this can just be, again, very minimal. You don't have to kind of essentially retouch any lost areas. It's sort of conservation in its purest form. Again, sometimes it might be appropriate to put some Japanese tissue over fills where there's cracks, again, so that dirt doesn't come in, or anywhere that where it's starting to come loose and lift, just again to hold it back. A light cleaning as well. When there's water stains, that's obviously going to be much more difficult to get out, especially if the pigment is water fugitive, but a light clean can also help as well. And again, got to remember that wallpaper is normally a composite object. So again, depending on the substrate it's on, it could be directly onto plaster, could be on a lining paper, could be like this, which was onto canvas, and the canvas had torn as well. And again, it might be one sheet of paper, or it might be several sheets of paper. So that's something to deal with as well. You're not just dealing with one sheet of paper, you're dealing with a multiple composite object. And again, if you're a paper conservator who isn't comfortable dealing with the canvas repairs, you might have to team up with a easel painter conservator or textile conservator so that you can conserve these different areas of the wallpaper, but keep the wallpaper complete. And that's one of the biggest challenges with wallpaper as well. Again, you can fill in wallpaper. So this is a Lincruster paper that we did a repair to. Again, they were going to paint the entire thing over, so we didn't need to worry about color matching. But we did this through creating a mold that's actually supplied by Lincruster, and this is one of our brilliant freelancers, Joe Walton. And then you literally create a new section from a mold that you've taken and just fill it in so that it fits perfectly against the old Lincruster. Again, sometimes it's more important to remove. So again, this was a small section of wallpaper that was completely failing, and it wasn't appropriate to take it back to the walls because of the reuse of the building and just the condition of the paper. So this is where it was more appropriate to let this wallpaper just, I mean, it was literally falling off the walls anyway. I think it was held up by the cobwebs. And this is when it's better to take it back and conserve it off-site. And again, then it's easier in the labs if you need to do any sort of lab-based treatment as well. And so how do you actually integrate wallpaper into a project in the wider context? You can simply record and research it. You could integrate it in a smaller, more subtle way through either framing or rehanging, or you can go all out and replicate the paper. So for recording and research, you can just if you have the fragments offsite, these can be scanned and they can be digitally reproduced. So first you've got the scale photograph, so you've got a record of it anyway, and obviously you've got this archived as an object by itself. But then you can also record it and potentially recreate it digitally as well. So this is what's happening here. And you get an idea from these fragments of what the wallpaper would have looked like as a whole. Again, with the paper in the original, it's obviously darkened slightly, but we've still kind of like kept this color of paper behind. And again, sometimes if you can't take the fragments off site, you can also work from a photograph and recreate the pattern and work out what's going on when you haven't got a full idea of the pattern or the design. So on this one, it was there were several papers overlying each other, and we wanted to know what this overlying paper was with these sort of with these big leaves. So by being able to digitally recreate this, we could understand what the pattern was a bit more, and by looking at some of the pigments, we could work out what the original colors were or were likely to be. And then we were really lucky in that we actually found a reference to this wallpaper, which isn't always possible, but the V&A have an excellent archive of wallpapers, and we found that it's actually the Melton design in the Westminster wallpapers, and this particular design was supplied until 1899, although these patterns did repeat sometimes, so these patterns can happen over multiple years, and then they happen in multiple colors, and we've got our blue design just over here. So that gives a bit of a story behind the wallpaper. You get an idea of the date that's going on. You get an idea of the cost as well. So we know this is 9p per piece. So you get an idea of the kind of the status of the people living there, and you really get to tell the story of the historic interiors a bit better. Framing and rehanging, again, sometimes you might not necessarily want to or it might not be possible to conserve or clean the wallpaper, but you might still want to know that it's there. So the clients in this case wanted to keep a window, which they then tidied. I haven't got an end photo, unfortunately, but just to show that this wallpaper is still there. Again, you've got some conservation issues to think about this. Obviously, this little section is going to get much more light than everything else. There's potential of dirt falling down. So whether you wanted to put a sort of UV glazing over this, but the benefits are that now people know it's there, and so then it's less likely to get damaged in future through accidental neglect. Sometimes as well, rehanging is important to tell a story. So this is from a room which I'll show you in a second. It's from a Welsh farmstead called Irisgurn, which is the family home of Hedwyn, who was a Welsh national poet who died in the Battle of Passchendaele in 1914. I've probably got that wrong now. World War I. This house has been in his family from the early 19th century, and his nephew still lived there until I think it was 2011 when he sold it to Snowdonia National Trust because he was getting too old to care for it. But he told the story of every time that they wallpapered, when his mum was still alive, they used to take the barometer off the wall and sort of repaper it properly. And as they got more and more lazy or sort of less inclined to do it, they ended up just tucking the wallpaper behind. And then in the end, they just cut the wallpaper around the barometer. So you've got this incredible, almost sculptural wallpaper around where this barometer had been. The entirety of this wallpaper had to come down because it was on, the walls were completely sodden and the entire room needed to dry out. So this wallpaper was falling off the wall. So we managed to collect these layers before they, and consolidate them all almost as a sculptural object. So again, this is now displayed in their visitor centre. So it's this sort of section of wallpaper is now sort of used almost as a historic object in its own right. And then we have replication, which is probably the most sort of invasive method of introducing it, the wallpaper into your project. So this is the larger room in Irisgurn. Again, you can see some things where there's been mechanical damage, where the chair has rubbed against. And you can also see that there's lots of wallpaper. You can already see it kind of falling off the walls. And once this stove was no longer on, the humidity went right up and everything started dropping off the walls. But we managed to collect a section of wallpaper that had as many layers as we could find, and this was just tucked behind one of the dressers and had what we think was some of the original wallpapers on. And as you can see, they're absolutely filthy, but also you can see just how many layers there are. And in the end, we found over 26 layers of wallpaper in this one section. So here's a small selection of some of them. And again, these kind of ish go in date order. We're missing some because I just put some of the best preserved ones up. But again, you can kind of see that that there's a theme going along, and obviously the people who lived here had they preferred floral colours, or they preferred sort of like a less modern sort of patterned wallpapers, although you can see some very vivid blues here and some pinks as well. So you get an idea of the kind of like the taste of the people in the house as well. Because there's so many papers over a relatively short period of time, that tells you that that they wanted to keep the house looking fresh as well. What we also found out through looking at the salvage edges was that all of these wallpapers are crown wallpapers. This building's in quite an isolated area of Snowdonia, so this kind of tells us that wherever they purchased their wallpapers from, maybe they didn't have the widest selection of wallpapers, so maybe their choice was more limited and they would have chosen different papers. So it tells you quite a lot about the sort of the social history, the sort of design history, just from looking at this sort of like one section of wallpapers. Also looking at these wallpapers, at first the client wasn't sure how they were going to represent this house, but because we found a wallpaper that we knew would have been around the time that Hedwyn left this house for the last time before he died, luckily we had a salvage edge with a pattern number. both of this one and the wallpapers either side. So we were really lucky and able to sort of like have quite a good idea of a date. They actually decided to recreate this wallpaper here. So on the left-hand side is the wallpaper after it's been cleaned and scanned in, and then Bruce's fine papers actually replicated this for us. And this is what it looks like in the cottage. So again, this is quite a big change, but it just shows that you can use wallpaper to completely change the project or completely help steer the project, or you can just use it as an object and as a storytelling item as well. Obviously, I haven't covered that much in there, and I've obviously missed out a lot, but further resources, there's some brilliant books. So The Papered Wall, London Wallpapers. There's some brilliant archives as well. The V&A have got an excellent online archive. Moda have quite a good archive as well, and the Jeffrey Museum. And then there's organisations you can go to as well for general advice on historic interiors as well as wallpaper. So you've got Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings. You've got the Wallpaper History Society as well. Historic England and conservation officers as well, that help you. Icon and other conservators in Icon. Obviously, you've got paper conservators, historic interiors conservators. You've also got specialists in wallpapers. We look at wallpapers, so do Alison McDermott and Phillipa Mapes are also fantastic wallpaper conservators. I think Phillipa is actually here today, so I'm sorry for basically talking about something that you know way more about. And then obviously various wallpaper manufacturers as well, who do still do woodblock printing, as well as other various methods of printing. And I think we've just hit time. So on to questions if anyone has them. Oops.
Thank you, Pip. That was amazing and informative and beautifully illustrated. Yeah, we have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So we had one from Ele about varnishes. Could we hear more about the varnishes on wallpapers? Are the print colours around 1900 generally oil? So kind of two questions there.
At this point, they'd probably be more likely to be ink, and then the varnish would have been just applied on top as well. I think sometimes that you could apply the varnish afterwards, almost kind of a DIY do-it-yourself, but also they would have been produced just with this sort of like protective varnish as well. I'm not entirely sure what types of varnish they are, just because that's not my area that I know that much about. Yeah, sorry, I wish I could be more informative.
So Sally asks, when they hand painted paper, what paint medium did they use?
Again, this could be a distemper paint. That's probably the most likely. Could use oil paint as well, but probably more likely to be a distemper.
Can't see any other. Can you comment, this is Cindy, can you comment on possible use of fungicidal agents through time, and also possible use of stencils in production?
For fungicidal, is that in terms of sort of the use of it for conservation or the use of it on wallpapers?
If you want to unmute yourself, Cindy, and ask the question. Historically, she says.
I'm not actually sure, to be honest. Again, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm doing really bad at answering these questions today, but I'm not actually sure about the use of, I mean, oddly enough, like the lead-based and arsenic-based wallpapers were fantastic at keeping mold at bay because they killed everything off. But I'm not really sure about the fungicide on wallpapers beyond that. Sorry.
She had another part to her question. Possible use of stencils?
Yeah, stencils could definitely be used. Again, wood blocking would tend to be used slightly more, just again because it was quicker to replicate. But stencils were used sometimes. But it was more likely to be wood blocking.
Getting lots of compliments for your talk. So Tom asks, what are the best techniques for lifting wallpapers from the wall without damage?
One is being very, very gentle and taking it slowly. Different areas of wallpaper can come off really, really easily, or just there's sometimes you'll kind of take off a certain amount and it'll be fantastic, and then you'll get to a small patch that just doesn't want to shift. And again, it's all about how the adhesive has bonded. What works really well is moisture and heat, because that helps to break down the adhesive a bit more. Also, if you add some moisture into the paper, it makes it a bit less brittle, so less likely to just completely crumble in your hands. Obviously, when you're introducing moisture, you just want to be a bit careful in terms of the pattern, and if the design is water soluble or not. So just kind of maybe do a little test on the side, or just start small in one corner, see how it reacts to things. Finding edges that have already lifted is always a good start as well, so that you don't have to actually dig in, you can just kind of help it on its way. Sometimes it does help as well to, if you have some Melanex, to slide that under the place you've just been, especially if there's adhesive there that is still kind of like, if you've made it moist and then it goes tacky, sliding a bit of Melanex underneath can help to stop it re-adhering back down. It also means that when you take it off, you're not sort of holding it by the corners and it's got all this weight, it's got something to support it a bit more as you move it from the wall to a different surface. So they're probably the best tips for it.
Fionn asked, were the earliest mechanized wallpaper printing machines powered by water or something else?
I actually don't know. I guess potentially water, because I guess it's just the kind of like the rotating, so it could be like a water mill, or it could be sort of more coal and steam powered. I actually don't know. Sorry.
Something to find out.
Yeah, definitely.
Sarah asked, I'm looking for sources for having silkscreen wallpaper from the 1960s, a historic home replicated. Do you have any recommendations?
I do, but I can't think off the top of my head what their name is. Again, Bruce's Fine Paper are good. They tend to specialize more in wood blocked rather than silk screened. I think they're called David Skinner, but I'll double check, and Sarah, I'll get back to you if you want to. I think you can send me a private message, and if you drop me your email address, I'll find out the names and email them across to you. Or if anyone else has any recommendations as well, please leave them in the chat.
Shona asked, have you ever come across iron gall ink on a wallpaper?
I haven't personally, but again, there's probably no reason why it wouldn't, but I would have thought that that it wouldn't be that common, because probably by the time you're using sort of inks to print, you probably would have moved on from iron gall ink. So, and you probably would have more likely to used sort of paints to woodblock. So I haven't personally come across them, but also I wouldn't be surprised if you did, but I don't think it's that common.
And we had a question from Bree. Thank you for the talk. You had mentioned finding production numbers on some papers. What other signs have you found most helpful when trying to date wallpapers?
One of the most helpful, again, sometimes by looking at the pattern you can get a general idea. Again, sometimes that's not that helpful, but also the condition. It sounds stupid to say, but if it looks old, it might be old. If it looks very new, it might be new. If the surface all looks completely flat and all of one thing, that's probably a later printing method. So for instance, the pattern on the back of where it says questions at the moment, that's all sort of completely flat, and that's probably more of a slightly modern technique. If you get these sort of like more raised looking things that are probably more sort of wood block, you know, where it sits on and then pulls itself away and you get the kind of raised areas, again, that's probably older, but not always, because it could have been used later. A big one really is the context, especially if you find it in a building. So what age is the building? The wallpaper probably won't predate that unless it's a really expensive scenic wallpaper that someone has moved from somewhere and rehung. Has it been found behind other wallpaper that helps you get more of a date? So there's some wallpaper that does look very of its time that has been applied underneath it or on top of it. And that can help you date the paper just by its own context. Again, things like, is it found behind a cupboard or under paneling or behind a door frame or under a light switch? That can kind of help give you kind of an idea of date. So context is probably the main one that I go off, and then after that it's those other things. Again, you can do sort of more material analysis on it, so you could do pigment analysis to see if that helps you date, to see if certain pigments used when in or out of production. Looking at the type of paper as well. If it's got wood pulp in it, it's probably going to be after 1840s. If it's pure rag paper, it's probably going to be before that, but not always. Again, if it's woad, so it hasn't got those laid patterns in, that's probably going to be sort of after 1730s. But again, not always. If it's in small sheets rather than long rolls, again, that helps you date because you've got the long rolls that only really started happening in the 1820s. So you've got a few things, but it's really all of these things in conjunction with each other that kind of give you more of a picture of what's going on.
Emily asked, what adhesive would you use to re-adhere wallpaper?
Just something like a starch paste would probably be fine. Again, sometimes tradition is best with that. In some cases, it might be appropriate to dot on some PVA as almost like stitching dotting if it's a really, really damp wall and you definitely don't want it to fall off. But I would recommend something like starch paste or something along those lines. Sometimes as well, if you don't want to adhere the actual wallpaper and you just kind of want to keep it there, using Japanese tissue is also useful, so that you're not directly sticking the paper to something, and then that gives you an option to help remove it, whether that's to mount board or whether that's back to the wall. It completely depends on the context and how it's going to be used and what the actual substrate is like. So yeah, when you're adhering it as well, you kind of want to see what state is the substrate in, because if it's on plaster that's completely failing, there's absolutely no point sticking it back if all this plaster is going to come out and fall behind the wallpaper, or that's going to fail, and so the wallpaper will fail. So making sure the substrate is sound as well before you adhere anything back is really important.
The same person asked tabs, question mark.
So just like very small strips of Japanese paper, and then you can just adhere one side of it to the actual paper and then one side to whatever substrate you're doing, so that if you do want to remove it, you don't have to peel the paper back off. You could just cut this little hinge where the tab joins from the paper to the wall. But again, with big heavy wallpaper, that might not happen either. Again, it completely depends on the size, the weight, the context, whether it's still on the wall, off the wall, type thing there.
So Cindy asked, you mentioned V&A archive of wallpapers. What are some other significant collections, and is digitization of patterns starting to happen?
I don't really know if there's a strong drive for digitization of patterns as kind of like a central thing. Again, it tends to be, someone finds something somewhere and they might upload it somewhere. MODA, so Museum of Domestic Architecture, I think I'd put it along here. They've got another really, really good one that's at MODA, especially sort of 19th century wallpaper. They've got a good array there. But the V&A is really sort of the best one. They've got the best online digital collection. Not everything is digitized, but a really good amount is. So that's kind of my first port of call to go on that. The Jeff Museum has got some as well. But another good thing is to contact the Wallpaper History Society as well. If it's something in terms of here's this pattern, I want to try and match this, I have no idea. They've got some excellent wallpaper historians and conservators in their ranks, and they could possibly give you some advice, or at least kind of point you in the right direction. But otherwise, the V&A is kind of the go-to. Some others are some wallpaper producers do have their own company archives as well, which can be useful, but these tend not to be digitized as much. They tend to be more kind of, you have to email them, say what you're looking for. I don't know if Temple Newsam still do, but that could be a good place to look as well.
Yeah, there are a couple of other recommendations. Does anyone else have any further questions? I had a question. Your digital recreations you did were amazing. Did you use a particular program for that?
I used Procreate for that, so it's a tablet-based one, just because I find that easier and I can draw on it straight over the photo on my iPad, but you could do it on Photoshop as well. But I would definitely recommend having a tablet or something just for that level of control. Yeah.
Great. Well, fantastic question. Thank you, everyone. So if no one else has any other questions.
Sorry, Pip.
Mm-hmm.
The program that you used for recreating the pattern of your wallpaper, would that be something that you could use for, say, recreating a design over textiles as well?
Could be used for anything. It's actually just designed as just like a digital art program. So it's called Procreate. I use it on my iPad. I'm going to get it out. And it's just really brilliant. It's got some really good brushes if you wanted to kind of make things look sort of realistic, or you could just have them kind of flat looking. The only thing is you tend to just have them out as sort of like a JPEG or a PGN rather than a vector drawing, but then you could take that into Photoshop and change that into a vector shape. So yeah, but it's really useful. It looks like this. It's called Procreate. You can add a new canvas in, and yeah, you can change the colors. So you probably can't see, however you want, and just draw on it however you like, and it's really sort of responsive. I don't think you're going to be able to see that, but yeah, it's brilliant. I would definitely recommend that if you're doing any sort of like having to do sort of fine details and trying to digitize stuff over there. Yeah, it's open source. I think you have I don't think you have to pay for it. I think you can just find it on the App Store. I think it's for iOS or Android. That's what. Hang on, let me get it up on the App Store. Yeah, it looks like this one here. Just looks like that. But yeah, it's really brilliant. I would definitely recommend it, even if whether you're doing sort of digital art, whether you're doing sort of like just want to draw over something. It's like a very easy to use Photoshop. You can layer things up, export it, have videos of what you've done. It's really great.
Amazing. Thank you.